Psychological egoism is a descriptive position which asserts that humans always act out of self interest. Psychological egoism should not be confused with ethical egoism, in that psychological egoism states how things are, whereas ethical egoism states how things ought to be. Psychological egoists argue that everything we do is out of our own self interest. For example, giving to charity, buying people gifts, having children, helping the old lady cross the street, holding the door open for others, being kind to others. Deep down, the egoist would argue, the reasons you do these things is solely because it makes you feel better about yourself in some way. Russ Shafer-Landau, who's a philosophy professor at the University of Wisconsin, specializes in moral philosophy. In his book, The Fundamentals of Ethics, he states, psychological egoism allows that we need not always be motivated by thoughts of self-interest. We can be motivated, say, by a desire to please others, or to meet a deadline, or to help a coworker out of a gym. We can have a wide variety of motivations, but psychological egoism says that all such motivations arise because of a deeper desire to benefit ourselves, where such benefit amounts to gaining something good or preventing something bad from happening to us. So if psychological egoism is true, then altruism is false. We would not be acting for others' own sake, but rather merely for our own sake. In other words, it ultimately comes back to self-interest. If this is true, do we even have a duty to help others? Here are the implications of the psychological egoist argument. Premise 1. If psychological egoism is true, then we cannot be altruistic. Premise 2. If we cannot be altruistic, then it cannot be our duty to be altruistic. The initial conclusion 3. Therefore, if psychological egoism is true, it cannot be our duty to be altruistic. Premise 4. Psychological egoism is true. The conclusion 5. Therefore, it cannot be our duty to be altruistic. So unpacking the following argument, Landau says that premise 1 is true by definition. Premise 2 also seems very plausible. If we cannot be altruistic, then it is not our duty to be altruistic. Landau maintains that the initial conclusion 3 logically follows from 1 and 2. So if they are true, as they certainly seem to be, then 3 must be true as well. We are then left with premise 4, which posits the truth of psychological egoism. If this is the case, then we have no duty, as Landau says, to be compassionate, considerate, kind, or generous. There are two main arguments that intend to reveal the truth of psychological egoism: the argument from our strongest desires and the argument from expected benefit. The argument from our strongest desires goes as the following. Premise 1. Whenever you do something, you are motivated by your strongest desire. Premise 2. Whenever you are motivated by your strongest desire, you are pursuing your self-interest. Conclusion. Therefore, whenever you do something, you are pursuing your self-interest. Psychological egoists would conclude that this argument elucidates that every action you perform is based on your strongest desire. But if your strongest desire is what is moving you, then you are acting out of self-interest. The second argument, which is the argument from expected benefit, claims that people always expect their actions to leave them better off. In other words, their constant drive is to gain from their actions. So here's the argument. Premise 1. Whenever you do something, you expect to be better off as a result. Premise 2. If you expect to be better off as a result of your actions, then you are aiming to promote your self-interest. Conclusion. Therefore, whenever you do something, you are aiming to promote your self-interest. One issue that psychological egoism faces is that some behavior just does not seem to be explained by self-regarding desires or expecting to be better off. For example, the soldier who dives on a grenade to save his unit would find it absurd if one were to argue that he did so just out of his own self-interest, or because he expected to be better off in some way. Ross McGinnis, who is pictured above, served in the United States Army during the Iraq War, and he was killed when he deliberately threw himself onto a grenade that was thrown into his Humvee, saving the lives of at least 4 others. We will never be able to ask McGinnis why he threw himself on the grenade, nor all of the other countless people that have made the ultimate sacrifice. But most of us would never consider the notion that McGinnis's courageous act was done out of self-interest, and we would find it egregious if anyone were to make such a claim. Well, the psychological egoist does make such a claim, and heroes like McGinnis are lying or are self-deceived, according to the egoist. The soldier may have thrown himself on the grenade to be remembered as a hero, or to receive medals, or because he could not have lived with himself afterwards, knowing the others would have died when he had the opportunity to jump on the grenade and save them. So if psychological egoism is true, such acts of sacrifice are a facade. If psychological egoism is true, then these explanations are wrong. None of these people was a true hero, since every one of them was driven by self-interest to save the lives of others. It is important to see how strong a claim this is. Psychological egoists are not saying that people usually act out of self-interest, or that altruism is rarer than it seems. Rather, their claim is that actions are never done from altruistic motives. Ultimately, if psychological egoism is true, morality as we know it has been greatly deceiving us. The truth of psychological egoism would spell the defeat of morality as we know it. If altruism is impossible, then morality cannot reasonably ask us to sacrifice self-interest for the sake of others. The central moral virtues of benevolence, kindness, and compassion would have no place in morality. If all we do is look out for number one, then there is little point in demanding we do otherwise.